It's Veritas Forum with Dr. Craig Johnson, professor in residence of Chalcedon Christian Academy and pastor of Bethel Christian Fellowship in Agora Hills.
Welcome to Veritas Forum. My name is Craig Johnson. My guest is James Patrick Holding, author of Shattering, the Christ Myth, and he is president of Tecton Apologetics. Welcome, JP.
Thank you, Craig.
I want to get a little bit of background information on you for our viewers. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, I'm from the great state of Florida, actually one of the last people who was born a native there. And my background is I have a bachelor's degree in English and I have a master's degree in library science from Florida State University. I would much rather have gone to the University of Florida, but I had to go with the Seminoles. I didn't really want to.
Well, you are a researcher. You are an author. You've written Shattering the Christ Myth. You've written The Impossible Faith, The Mormon Defenders, Blowing the Doors Off. You've got a lot of other books in the pipeline. You're a researcher primarily. Tell us a little bit about critical use of sources. In this program, I want to talk about Wikipedia. I want to talk about the fact that in our information age, all you got to do is go to Google and everyone's an instant expert, it appears. How do we evaluate sources and materials just for general study, let alone religious study?
Precisely. Let's mention that this is a very difficult problem precisely because of what you said. There is very little critical use of sources these days by many people. It is simply believed, used to be, if it's on television, it must be true. Now that's shifted to, if it's on the internet, it must be true. And there's many reasons for this. Some people simply don't want to go to all the trouble of looking something up. Other people, there's perhaps some pride involved. They feel that, well, I know best. I can evaluate this source critically for myself. I can make my own decision. I don't need this egghead with the PhD telling me what to do. And so we have so many people like producing things in print and on the internet who don't know what they're talking about. And then in turn we have people accepting it because they don't have the expertise to judge the credibility of the source that they're reading or that they've picked up off the internet. And this is a serious, serious problem today.
So give us some guidelines in choosing to view an article. Let's say there are a lot of articles of Christ mythers, people who are denying the historical existence of Jesus. And if you bring them up on Google, there's just tons of websites on this subject. And people are writing 30-page articles, all footnoted. And what are some, how can we develop our critical skills?
Certainly. Well, I've put together some guidelines, and I should point out that these are based on my experience as a person who knows library science. These are the same kind of criteria that professional researchers will use in evaluating a source. So this is not something that I'm simply making up. And you don't have to just give up and say, I'll just pick the source I like best. You can do some of this legwork, and it isn't that difficult. And there are some basic research guidelines. I'm going to go over these one at a time and explain exactly how they apply to any particular book that you might pick up or any particular internet resource. Because you're right, you see a source and it may use a lot of footnotes, and you may think simply because it does that it's particularly imposing. But if you just take a little closer look, you can find out some things that will tell you whether or not a source is to be trusted. Now, I should point out as well, these guidelines I'm going to give you are not 100% ironclad absolutes. There are always potential exceptions. But you can at least start with a critical eye and eliminate some of the dross, so that you can come to the gold and at least find that more quickly. Okay? So let's go ahead and talk about some of these things that I look at personally as a researcher when I'm evaluating any given source. And mind you, this is whether it's a Christian source, this is whether it's a source by a pagan, it's whether it's a source by an atheist. They should all get the same treatment, okay? All right, the first guideline is the most basic and the most obvious, and that is check their credentials, right? And what am I talking about when I say credentials? What I'm talking about is, have they received a proper education in the field that they are writing to? I like to use this example when I talk to youth. You know, if you're getting sick to your stomach right now, you don't go to the phone book and call Tire Kingdom, do you? Right? You don't call up the tire store. Who do you call when you're feeling sick? You call a doctor. And why would you call a doctor rather than the guy at Tire Kingdom? Well, because hopefully the doctor went to medical school, he had all that training, he had all that education, he knows his business, right? In everyday life, we will naturally gravitate towards someone who knows their business when we have some kind of problem. If some of these people who accept anything and everything off of Wikipedia or what have you were consistent, they would go out to Tire Kingdom to get their bad stomach taken care of. Because everyone's opinion is as good as anyone else's, right? Well, if you really believe that, then you won't see a doctor first thing off when you're sick. You will just see anyone out there. So what you have to look for, and thankfully most books will have something like this, you will look on the book itself or whatever source it is or on the web page, and you will try to find out what credentials these people have, what kind of degrees they have, what kind of schooling they have, whether they've published in the field previously or done something similar. And here's what you have to look out for. If you go to a book and you see that there are no credentials listed, you go there and you see that they're not relevant credentials, and this is something especially that applies to the Christ myth. You know, one of the leading Christ myth books for a while was written by a guy who was a kidney doctor. He's obviously not a historian. He's an expert in some other field. Or if it says that they have a PhD from Vanderbilt or whatever, but it doesn't say what it's in, then some caution is warranted about that source. Because if they don't have the credentials, then it's possible that they have come into the field not knowing what they're talking about and do not have the discipline to recognize what is good in that field they're discussing. Now, there's a certain caveat involved in that too. Okay, that doesn't mean that someone like that can't write a book that is very good on these subjects. But if that's the case, if they don't have the credentials, then you might need to look at the sources they use to make their case and see what their credentials are. So in other words, you may not have to be a doctor to write a book on medicine, but at the very least, your book should be filled with footnotes to medical sources, to medical doctors, to nurses, to whoever knows the business well.
So are they credentialed, and also are they credentialed in that field? Because they could have a PhD in trampoline and they're making pronouncements on nuclear physics. So we need to watch closely. But again, C.S. Lewis was not credentialed in a way that often people had a great respect for him during his day. So how do we guard against intellectual snobbery? And even people have said that you're not credentialed to be writing on certain issues, critics of your website and so on. How do we balance that?
That's where you do have to look at the sources they use and have to compare them to the sources that have the credentials and see if that's what they're using. You know, Lewis was very careful not to step outside his field. He was an expert in literature, and most of the commentary he made had to do with the literature of the Bible. But he also got into philosophical arguments. And for that, you know, he relied very much on common sense and upon his own thought. There are some things he said that he probably shouldn't have. If he had known some of the scholarship we're familiar with now, he probably would not have said some of those things. But this is why it's not enough to simply pick up one source and decide you're done. Okay? These issues are very complex. And so if you're going to be a critic, you know, if you're going to just understand the Bible simply, that's one thing. But if you're going to be a critic of the Bible and try and tear it apart, or if you want to be a disciple and understand it better, you must get deeper into the sources and the source material.
So credentials first.
Credentials are the first
and then
thing.
sources. Now, how would one check their sources in a book or a journal article?
The best thing to do when checking a source to see whether it is a reputable one is to go towards the back matter in a book or at the end of a magazine article or at the end of an internet article. You need to look at the sources and see whether there are any to begin with. I can't tell you how many times I have dealt with people who refer me to some internet article or some book, and I turn it to look for footnotes or endnotes, and there are none. Or there's maybe 5 in a book that's this big, and it's usually to the Bible or something like that. It's just a reference to something inside the Bible or inside some text. If this person is not doing any serious research, if they're just sitting down, typing away, giving their own opinion, that's not going to be worthwhile. I'm not saying that there aren't some scholars who can do stuff like that, but some people who have done that, who have become scholars, have earned the right to be able to just sit down and type freely from what they remember and from what they have studied. If this person who has created this source is not a scholar in the field, then they need to be heavily footnoting their claims. They need to be documenting what they say. All right. Now, again, because some people have been scholars, they can get away with not documenting certain things because it's taken for granted in their own field. They don't have to document some things that are a given in their own field. But if you are writing to an everyday person, you had better make sure that you document the things that you say. And so it's very important to look inside a source and see if they use documentation. Now, some warnings associated with this. If you go inside and you see very few or no references, that can be a warning that someone has not done the necessary homework. If you see incomplete citations, if you see them just giving a title of a book with no page number, that can be very suspicious. It implies that they don't want you to find something inside that book. Okay? They don't want you to go look it up for yourselves because they know if you do, you'll find out that they're not using it properly. If you see them using sources that are overwhelmingly old, now there's an exception to that. If they're doing a historical survey or something like that, that's okay. Or if they're doing something on ancient history, of course you use some ancient sources to document what you want to say. But if you're finding them using sources written in the 1850s to document something like the pagan copycat Christ myth, the idea that the story of Jesus was stolen from pagan gods, you will find that many of those people are using sources from the 1800s. Mm-hmm. And that's where they get their information. It's like they feel that scholarship stopped in 1873, mm-hmm. when obviously it didn't. Another good example, so much is said about the Dead Sea Scrolls and how they're going to overturn Christianity. The Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered in 1945. If you don't use some sources older than, that are more recent than 1950 about the Dead Sea Scrolls, you're not covering the whole idea adequately. Because so much more has been written about it. And we're living in a golden age of scholarship and apologetics right now, where so much more is being discovered or rediscovered and applied in new ways. If you're not keeping up to date on these things, if you're continuing to use sources that were last read when Disco Duck was the big hit on the radio, then you are not doing a good job of dealing with your sources.
So credentials, sources, and what do you call, you speak of recommendations.
Recommendations as well. Now, this is a very important thing, especially these days, and publishers are becoming much more conscious of this. Very often, when a book is written by a scholar these days, they will go and seek out other scholars to review the manuscript, probably before it's published, and to make some kind of comment. You say, well, I recommend this book because they did a very good job, what have you. And they will print the recommendations on the back of the book. I'm conscious of this. For Shattering the Christ Myth, I sought out the recommendation of Lee Strobel, the Christian apologist. Okay, I had him give me his recommendation, because people look at things like that. Now, if you can't get some endorsement like that, that's not necessarily a bad thing, but you should look at who they have endorsing their book and see who it is. These scholars like Ben Witherington and N.T. Wright will get other scholars of similar persuasion, but they will also get people of somewhat different persuasion as well to comment on their book. So what you're looking for is not only recommendations necessarily, but recommendations from a wide variety of sources of different ideologies, even people who might be considered your ideological enemy at times. Well, that's kind of rare. Like if you can get some leading atheist to say, I don't agree with the conclusions here, but this is great. I think this is a good book. That's really unusual, but it can be done. On the other hand, what you want to look out for is people who get someone to recommend their book who are their editor or their daddy or their friend or what have you, or some nobody off the street, just someone who happened to like what they said. That's not going to be good enough. Another good place to look for recommendations is from professional review sources. I'll give you an example is the magazine Publishers Weekly. Now that's a review source by professional researchers, librarians like me, people who read the books and evaluate them as sources. That's a good thing to look for, but you got to watch out for the way people use these recommendations. I'll give you an example. There was a book by a fellow named Robert Eisenman, which proposed this radical theory about James, the brother of Jesus. And on the back of the book, he had a quote from Kirkus Reviews, which is a major publishing review source. And it quoted two words. And it was, two words were basically, fascinating reading. Well, I went and looked up the review of Kirkus of that book. And yeah, it said it was fascinating reading. But then it went on to say, but it never gets very convincing. Isn't that kind of a selective use of that review, would you say?
A little bit.
Just a little bit selective. So, I don't imagine a lot of people are going to go check out reviews in Publishers Weekly. But if you have some suspicions, if it seems like they've quoted selectively just two words out of what is probably a longer review, you might be well served to check out what they're quoting and see if it's in context and see if there's more to it.
Well, you're president of Tecton Apologetics, and you are doing the work all day long. You are reviewing material. You do book reviews for Christian Research Institute. You are always engaged in assessing and evaluating. Are these the steps that you go through every time that you are reviewing a book or an article?
Oh, yeah, because I'm such a dork, I love doing that stuff. This is the kind of thing I love to do. I love to go into the stacks and dig things out. Some people just hate doing homework. They hate doing book reports. That's another reason why sources like Wikipedia are so popular these days, is because people want to get their answer in a can and be done with it. In contrast, I don't mind spending hours in a library plucking one book at a time off the shelf looking at it. I go to the seminary library near where I live, Reformed Theological Seminary in Orlando, Florida, and I will take down a whole stack of commentaries at one time and put them on the table and then go looking through them for what I need. Librarians will give me a dirty look and that'll be that.
Now, you mentioned next that there are subjective reasons why people tend to like certain sources or accept certain sources. What would those be?
Right. And I frame these in a negative sense. There are things they'll say when you, let's say if you try and bring up my book on any one of those subjects, or you try and bring up a book by a scholar like Ben Witherington, in many cases, because some of these skeptics and cynics cannot answer the arguments in these books, they don't have the knowledge or ability to answer, they've come up with these contrived excuses for saying, well, I'm not going to accept that because blank. And it's an absolutely ridiculous reason. So let's talk about some of these reasons that I've heard out there, okay? Number one favorite reason, that's a biased source. You ever heard that one before? Yeah. Oh, that's biased. It's biased towards a point of view. Well, hello, the truth is a biased point of view. Because it is the truth. It is naturally biased towards the truth. Because that's what it is. And so saying that a source is biased is not an answer. It doesn't rebut anything in that source, and it doesn't give you any reason to reject that source. Now again, I do have a caution here. We can say that, well, this book is published by some crazy publisher that does stuff on time travel and Atlantis and UFOs. That's not an argument by itself, but it is a warning signal to say, well, we might need to give this book a much closer look because look where it's coming from. And you don't automatically reject something by an atheist because it's published by Prometheus Press, which is the lead atheist publisher. You don't reject something published by Ben Witherington just because it came from Fortress Press. You don't just do that. You need to justify that. But you can give it as something as a warning signal if it is a particularly disreputable publisher. So that's the bias reason. That's the most popular one. I think about 90% of what I hear comes from that.
Now let me interject. Yeah. I've actually heard people saying, well, you can't trust the records of the four Gospels because they're written by true believers. Well, on that basis, if we applied that to ancient history, then I don't think we could believe much of anything.
No, there's so many examples. Of course, I know one of the favorite examples is so much of the history of the Holocaust was written by Jews. It's well worn to appeal to the Holocaust, but that's because it's a very good example. If you're going to play that game consistently of, well, it was written by people who had an interest in it, you are going to throw out a lot of ancient history, including the Annals of Tacitus, which is the most reliable ancient history according to the historians. Tacitus was a very biased individual. It's a huge complaint against him. He disliked so many different people, and he had a point of view to promote in his work, and yet he is still considered reliable enough to be trusted overall. In fact, the historians will say, yes, we know he's biased, but you know what? His scruples were such that he wouldn't report falsehoods despite his biases. It's like he might spin things a certain way, but you're still able to get the truth out of him. And so bias does not keep you from discerning truth in a source. It does give you caution in evaluating it, but that doesn't mean that it's reporting a falsehood, not at all. And so it's not a sufficient excuse.
So after bias?
After bias, the reason that I hear most often is the fallacious appeal to popularity. In other words, look at all those positive reviews on Amazon that this book has got. Or look at how, my mommy or daddy like this book, or my friends like this book. It's a bestseller. It's a bestseller. Well, Mein Kampf was a bestseller in Germany at the time, to use once again one of those Nazi analogies.
That's right.
Just because a lot of people like it, it doesn't mean anything. I mean, if you will see some of these Christ myth books, people giving them 5 stars on Amazon. Of course, you'll have people like me sticking 1-star reviews on them too, just to balance it out.
So you don't determine truth in terms of counting noses and...
No, you don't count noses, especially when you consider that most of these people who write reviews are similarly uncredentialed people. They're just your Joe the Plumber reviewing a scholarly book. Are you really going to think that he has something authoritative to say on that? But so many of these people who trust sources like Wikipedia, they do so because they think information should be democratized.
Now, Wikipedia also has their little warning that they put in, that we don't have any footnotes here, we don't have any authoritative sources, or they may not be true, or how do you handle that?
I see that's been about as useful as the Surgeon General warning has been for cigarettes and stopping those. I mean, you think people read that, or you think if they do, they really care? I understand that a lot of teachers or professors will tell their students, I will not accept anything from Wikipedia. And I can understand why. You know, my name for Wikipedia is the abomination that causes misinformation. It is an abomination to someone like me to see a source that anyone, 14-year-old named Jason from Missouri or whatever, can get on there and change anything. Now they say, well, we have controls. We make sure things don't get too crazy. Well, that depends on their knowledge and authority and how much they know at Wikipedia. And they may not know anything either. Now, you're obviously not going to be able to slip some really crazy stuff in there all the time. But if you slip it in there and it just sounds reasonable enough, their editors are not going to catch it, and it's going to stay there. And people are going to call up that article, and they're going to believe what it says. So they say they have controls. They do, but they're not good enough. Not in my perspective as a professional researcher.
So you are doing this work all the time. What are some other guidelines?
Okay, a couple other guidelines. Another one is if they say, you should read this because it's provocative or it opens your mind. Now, all too often, that appeal is simply because it promotes something radical that they think should be given a hearing, irrelevant to facts or how well the case is made. Simply because something is provocative or supposedly opens your mind is not a good reason to trust it as a source. That doesn't say anything about its quality whatsoever. Now,
Well, that's always popular in the academic world, too, to do your PhD dissertation on some wacky perspective in order to gain a hearing.
Well, yeah, there's a certain wisdom in that because the idea of your PhD is not that you have people reviewing it, and if you know more than they do, then they're more likely to give you an A, right? Mm-hmm. Because they can't really counter you. Now, I had a college professor who did that, not the way you're talking about, but he purposely picked an obscure subject to write about because he knew he'd have an advantage. I can see some wisdom in that. But tactically speaking, for research purposes, if you're looking for some reliable source, that kind of thing is not something you can trust automatically. It has to earn the trust that you give it. Now, I've seen a certain attitude by the cynics and skeptics. Again, they say, they're very confident in their own ability to discern the truth. And they have not gone through the same legwork that someone like you or I have gone through. They've not gone through the sources. You find out what their reading list is. It's maybe one or two things. And that's it. And they think that thereafter they are competent to make an evaluation. And I like what one scholar came up with as a name for this. There was a scholar named Dunning who had an assistant named Kruger. They came up with something called the Dunning-Kruger effect, which is summed up by saying people are incompetent and unaware of it. And the more incompetent they are, the least likely they are to be aware that they are incompetent. And so they continue to promulgate themselves as experts when they really aren't.
When you're being critiqued, when your works are being critiqued, when you're engaging in dialogue with skeptics, how often do you see people trying to take shortcuts and present their view as a scholarly view? Is this something that's happening in all of your encounters?
Nearly all of them, I'd have to say. At the very least, it's premised in the arrogance they display when they come to you saying, well, you're believing some ridiculous stuff there. Or one of the more common things is, well, you believe in a talking snake, or you believe in a man coming back from the dead. And it's simply assumed to be ridiculous on its face without any argumentation whatsoever. And the odd thing is, these are some people who will believe that the universe came out of nothing.
Yeah, all the laws of physics popped out of nothing.
Exactly.
Nothing times nobody equals everything, and we're supposed to be
exactly.
idiots.
But they don't realize the absurdity of that in contrast to something like a resurrection, which is a piece of cake compared to something coming from nothing. That's just a matter of manipulation of matter and energy versus making matter come out of nowhere.
So you're not just talking about critical research skills here. We're also blending into informal logical fallacies. People with bluster and tone and body language, Bill Maher with religulous and all of these. You can use humor and bluster in place of arguments.
Yes. And now, there's nothing wrong with humor and bluster. I like it myself. I use it constantly. But I also use it with my arguments. Once I'm done arguing, then I might add some just for a few special effects. Or once it's become clear that it's useless to talk to someone, then that's all I'll use.
But you salt and pepper the recipe with it. It's not either
right.
or.
It's not the only thing you put on the table, exactly. It's not the main course, it's the seasoning. Whereas with many of these people, the bluster is the main course. That's what they'll offer you primarily. And they might, in their case, the seasoning is the argument they've picked up from some 19th century source or what have you. And it's a balance, like 80-20 real argument versus bluster.
So you're not intimidated by tone and body language and bluster and personal attack.
Not in the least.
You just want to get to the argument.
Yes.
Give me the argument. Give me the sources. Give me the references. Give me credentialed people. And so when you apply these standards, when you're expecting this of those that are engaging with you, what is their reaction? Do they just leave you alone after a while? Do they?
Oh, there's a lot of frustration that I get. It depends on the level of the person I'm talking to. But in many cases, they're very frustrated because they know they can't do the legwork, or they really don't want to. I guess they don't want to miss the Brady Bunch or whatever. They're too busy watching TV. They don't want to go out and do anything. But Jesus called us to be disciples. And a disciple is not a couch potato. Jesus didn't say, blessed are the couch potatoes. A disciple is someone who goes out and learns and serves. And so as Christians, we don't have to know everything, of course, but we should be willing to do the work to defend our faith. That's where we have to be different from these people who call and bluster all the time. Not all of us are called to do this. Many of us are called in the body of Christ to be the heart. Some of us are called to be the head. Unfortunately, I like to say too many of us are being the tail. And we're just sitting around. We're the part of the body of Christ that just sits in the chair. Too many of us. And so, be able to be willing to be more into your faith, to understand more about why you believe what you do, or encourage those who are doing that for you.
And support those
Yes.
who are doing that work.
That's right.
I'm reading your book, Shattering the Christ Myth, that you just put out. It's a remarkable opportunity. It's a remarkable example of expanding your mind as a Christian, also getting answers to tough questions. And that is such an important work. And I noticed that I was using some of these principles when I looked at your book initially as well. We look for credentials. We look for references. We want to see sources. And I think that these can be ingrained in us so that we do these things naturally. And hopefully this program is contributing towards people being a little bit more aware, or maybe a little more suspicious of Google and Wikipedia. They're not hearing from Mount Sinai when they go to Wikipedia on any issue.
No.
Nor should they doubt everything, but we need to have the sense of an old cow and eat the hay and spit out the sticks.
We do. And there was an article in one of the magazines called "Does Google Make Us Stupid?" And it talks about how people who have formerly been heavy readers have started using Google, and it's made them less patient with reading and less willing to do the research. I was used to using resources like Google and databases like it in library science school, so I'm used to doing those. There's nothing wrong with them inherently. But when you let them do your legwork for you and let them do your critical thinking for you, you're going to fall into a trap.
James Patrick Holding, president of Tecton Apologetics, author of Shattering the Christ Myth, The Mormon Defenders. Any questions you have, you can send them to JP, and I want to encourage you to get his books. Go to Amazon.com. He's a well thought out scholar. He is practicing what he's preaching, and we live in a time when we need to be giving sound answers with regard to our faith. The faith once delivered to the saints. There are answers. They are sound, and we would encourage you to go and search them out. We'll see you next time on the Veritas Forum.